Yeah, thanks very much for the intro. Thank you so much to the organizers. This has been great already. I want to start off by saying that everything I'm going to talk about is really not just me. Our community, I think, is growing in a very good direction. And really, all of this is the result of some fantastic collaborations, including some people that are here, like Jim and Catherine as well. Yeah. I think yesterday a lot of the discussions were about we're getting to a point now where we have a lot of large-scale data now. Now what do we do with it? And what kind of data should we collect? I'll try to assume that for all of this talk, or I'll just declare that our goal is to build an accurate model of the brain and how it supports intelligent behavior. We can maybe discuss after if you think that is not the goal, but I do think that is going to enable some things. For instance, I think that is a good description of how human intelligence might be implemented in computational terms. It might lead to next generation AI, and it might also have some applications in clinical settings. And I think, especially with regards to yesterday, having this computational understanding, that is one way to integrate all of these data together. Like you can have one model that ideally is guided and constrained by all the data that we have collected and will collect. So the two main things I want to convey today are, first, I think just the data alone is often not enough. When we want to model the brain, then really we need experimental benchmarks at scale, and I'll talk to you what that means. And I think those make the research more efficient and also accessible to newcomers, and I have an example of what that can look like. And also I want to say that the models that we have today in vision and language, I think, are actually pretty decent already, and we can start using them for guiding experiments and also for some cool other things. So most of the field, I think, operates sort of in this isolated fashion right now. I mean, I know that this room is a very good example of where I think we could be heading, but I would say, by and large, many people are still sticking in some electrodes, collecting some isolated data, then we build a model, and then maybe there's another lab that sticks electrodes somewhere else, and they also build a model, and then eventually we're left with this conglomerate of data that doesn't really talk to each other, and also models that maybe each model, one individual data set, but we don't even know if that's going to be general for other data. I was worried when Bing before showed this example where you don't see the full picture because I thought it was going to be an elephant. I think like the analogy I'm going to use is you only see parts of the elephant with this approach. You don't really know what the full picture is. All of this is necessary, but if we're serious about building a unified model of things like vision or language or the whole brain, then this, I think, is insufficient. So instead, what I think we should be doing is to build models that explain all the data. All past, present, and future data that we can never collect. And I think one just intuitive way to get there is what we call integrative benchmarking, which really just means let's put all the data together and use it collectively to constrain the models. And the platform we're developing for this is called BrainScore, that we might have heard about, and the idea is that this will get us to a full picture of the entire elephant. And in Satra's terms, I want to point out here that level 0 data, where there's no metadata, is just completely useless here. We need metadata in order to run the models like we do the monkeys and humans. I know we're past the lunch break, so I'm going to try and help you stretch a little bit. So let's say you're a subject in this experiment, and your task is to fix it on the dot. And I'm going to flash an image, and afterwards there's going to be two sample images. And this is to show you one sample data set that we're considering here. One of the two sample images is going to be closer to the image that we saw before, the other one is not. So raise your left hand if you think it's the one on the left, and your right hand if you think it's the one on the right. Ready? Okay, cool. You're all being paid. So you can keep doing this if you wanna stretch a bit. These are gonna get harder eventually. So we're varying the viewpoint parameters here for some of them. Oh yeah, okay. You're already disagreeing with each other. Turns out, yeah, other humans also disagree, and they're you can keep going if you really feel like stretching it. And so we can compute how much people disagree with each other and how difficult it is to do these categorization tasks, because we have ground truth information. So we build this confusion matrix. Each row is basically an image. Each column is the choices you can make. And then there are things that are easier, like fork versus dog is maybe easy, but like you saw, rhino versus elephant might be more difficult. So when we test models on this, then in this benchmarking paradigm, this is our data. But like I said, this is not the only thing. The other thing is also how exactly did we run the experiment, what images did we run, and what visual degrees did we run them, what order. And then we use those we run those on the model. So we just have the model look at the stimuli, we have it perform the same task. There's some detail on how we do that. I'm going to skip that in the interest of time. But eventually the model makes a prediction of what the behavior should look like. And then we can just compare with different metrics how similar are the data, the behavioral data, to the model predictions. And here, for instance, this is not just ground truth accuracy. This is really image level alignment, right? Like if the humans make mistakes, we also want the models to make mistakes. One nice point about this kind of experimental or this kind of task setup is that macaque monkeys can do them as well. So their visual cortex is extremely similar to ours. This is a monkey run in Schrimpf's lab. And that allows us to then implant electrodes that we can record from in order to figure out what is going on as they look at these images. So I usually think of this as one vector per image, we time average. So at the end, you're left with this matrix of neurons times images, where each element in the matrix tells you how active is one particular neuron for one particular image. And so then again, turning this into a benchmark, that is the data. We also have an experimental paradigm where, again, we show those images and can run this on the model. So usually the models we work with are deep neural networks. When we record from these models, then that to us just means retrieving the internal layer activations. So there's many layers in the network. There's one that we declare to be V1 and one that we declare to be IT. And then the activations of that layer are the predictions of the model in response to this particular experiment. And we can, again, compare those. There's many different metrics. I like this one. It's going to give us a score. And that is sort of the overall setup. So we can now do this across the entire hierarchy of the visual system, or the visual ventral stream more specifically, ranging from V1 through IT to behavior. And when we test a bunch of models, we can start with something like with HMax. Who still knows HMax? Yeah, who knows? Okay. Not many, okay. HMax is, I guess, a model from, I think, the 1999, so early on. It was pretty good for a while. I think like right now it's not considered as good anymore. But this is sort of classic neuroscience. We can now also run the kitchen sink of computer vision models. So these are models that people build not for a purpose of brain alignment or anything about the brain, really. It's models that are built for classification mainly. If we test those models, some of them actually do quite well. Specifically, they do better than the classic neuroscience we had before. And I think it's fair to say that some of those models are, at least today, state-of-the-art for these neural and behavioral alignment tests that we have in vision. And I want to emphasize again, none of these were trained on biological data. Like these are task-optimized models, so they also might give us some insight of how the system got to where it is. All of this is hosted up to date on the BrainScore website, so I encourage you to check that out after the talk. And I think that the strength here really is we can compare all models in a unified manner. So we can very, very clearly say which model is better than others because they've all been treated exactly the same. They also scale to many benchmarks, so it's easy for the community to add more and more of those benchmarks. And each new benchmark can be run on any existing model or new model, and any new model can be run on any of the benchmarks. So this is set up in a way that it scales together. And to show you that our community is making true on adding more benchmarks here, I like to just show the slide. This is where we are today. This is around 50 benchmarks. These are not just regression-based. They're also distributional tests of like centers around in V1, different generalization and behavior. And I still think this is far from where we want to be. Like this is the state today, but really this, to me, is more of a beginning. Like this is still, if you want to constrain million parameter models, this is way too little. And we get around one model submission per day at the moment. So really what I think we should be doing, and I hope the NIH agrees with us and funds us, is that we want to funnel something like Dandy into this directly so that we can really use any new data that is being collected and use it to constrain models. Now, one thing this enables is you can ask some why questions about the models. For instance, you can collapse over the score. So we're going to take an aggregate, sort of the mean of all the scores. So one dot now is going to be one model. And across many models, we might wonder what explains the model differences. So guided by early work by Dan Niemans, we looked at ImageNet top-1 performance. ImageNet is this big data set in computer vision that I think everyone knows by now. It's object classification. And turns out models that do better at classifying objects are also more brain-like, at least to some extent. If you look at the latest models and keep optimizing on ImageNet, eventually this actually falls off. And there's still a big gap. So we're far from done, but I think this is some first success. And this is one example of where I think lots of data can be useful to track these relationships. I'm just going to flash through these in the interest of time, but there are many other relationships we can discover. For instance, does improving the model on neural alignment improve its behavioral alignment? Or is robustness anything that tracks with different brain alignment? Like, for instance, we found that models that are more like V1 also tend to be more robust. But again, I'm going to skip that in the interest of time and just say this. I think this part is really what drives the point home. So the x-axis here is the number of neural benchmarks that we use to find the best model of the brain under those benchmarks. And the y-axis is a held-out benchmark of behavior. So this basically says, as you add more neural benchmarks, you also align better to behavior. So if we were to do many, many more of these, I think then the likelihood that we will do well on benchmark n+1 just increases. Okay. I want to also mention some words about language, because I think really this approach started in vision, but it's very broadly applicable. So the problem is very similar, where we ask, is the human language system similar to models? And now the data is not monkey recordings, but rather mainly fMRI as well as ECOG data. And we also found here that as we test model alignment to the human language system, and again, over many, or three data sets, that's what we had access to at the time. We hope that's going to be more. We actually found some models, especially GPT-2, that really did exceptionally well. And again, similar to vision, we found that models that are better at some task, in this case it was next word prediction, so predicting the next word in a sequence, those models also tend to be better models of the brain. This may be a quick plug for an alpha version of BrainScore language that we're starting to roll out. This is really taking BrainScore from vision to language. We hope there will be many, many benchmarks. We already have all of those up. We have a lot of the models up. So if you work on this, then I hope this will be useful to you. The nice thing about this is students that maybe don't really know what fMRI is or how all of this data were collected, they can also make very quick use of this. So we've had one master student work with us this summer. So this is a 3-month summer project that the DPL funds. And the question he asked was really, if you take these large language models and you optimize them on world knowledge, and people do this mainly with instruction tuning. So what that means is you give the model some kind of context, you give it some options, and then you ask, like, which of those options would you choose? And then you optimize it on that, and by doing so, you make it more human-like and also increase its world knowledge, as has been shown. And so then he just used those models, he plugged them into BrainScore and tried to see, does that improve the alignment to brain data? And turns out it does. And he did a lot more that I'm not going to talk about, but I think this really shows, like, in one summer, a cool paper came out of this, and you didn't have to know everything about data analysis. Just with open source tools, that student was able to make a lot of quick progress. The student was also exceptional, but really I think the tools helped too. The last thing I want to say is that the models, I think, are also at a stage where we can start to use them for experiments. Like, this came up a bit yesterday as well, and maybe also today. Right now, the way we collect data is somewhat random. Like, we sample, and we hope that we get the right data. At least for model purposes, I think we can start to move towards some more targeted collection paradigms. And I'll give you one example of that. So I told you before, we have some models that are doing pretty well on alignment to the human language system. So we took one of those models, and by we, I really mean Greta Tukute. So she took GPT-2 and then aligned it to brain data from new subjects. So this is really just making the model predict different voxels in different subjects that she recorded. And then she had a big text corpora that she ran through the model and chose the sentences that the model predicts to drive or suppress the language system. So basically make activity really high or really low. So you can rank order the sentences, and you choose sort of the highest predicted ones and the lowest predicted ones. And we divide those into drive and suppress sentences. And then we go back, and sort of similar to what Andreas was talking about before, we validate that those predictions of the model are actually correct. So we show those two subjects in the fMRI scanner and see if that works out. Really, the end product of all of this is the model gives us sentence predictions that should drive or suppress the language system. To give you some examples of the drive ones, you can read them here. I think that the drive ones, people typically say they're a bit more surprising. Maybe they're not quite as smooth if you read them, whereas the suppressed sentences are perhaps a bit more boring. They're sort of things that you would expect in the real world. And turns out this approach actually works. So as you run the drive and suppress sentences in humans, you can control the neural activity in the language system, and you can make it go higher and lower, and then Greta did a lot more analysis on what the underlying factors of all of this are. But I think really the power here is that we can use the models to search a large space that otherwise we would have no control over. And here we can make the experiments much more efficient. Okay, I'm gonna wrap up there, bring it back to the two things I think you should take away from this. One is, yeah, data alone is really not enough. I think converting it with rich metadata into benchmarks that you can use to run models on it and to make the data accessible to modelers who might not know everything about neuroscience is really a key in making our field more efficient. And also make it accessible to newcomers. And then second, I think we are at a point where the models are pretty decent, at least in some fields, and we can start to use them for experiments, and we can ask questions between models, like which ones are really better and which ones make very different predictions, and then actually verify that all of that in biological subjects. Cool. With that, I'm happy to take your questions. Thanks.
Thank you for the talk. So, in the beginning, one of the overarching goal you mentioned was moving to clinical applications. So, I was wondering, how do you envision the transition from what we have now, which is a leaderboard, people submitting and trying to improve the models, to clinical applications, and how do you envision this process, and what do we need in order to move?
Yeah, I'll try to give one example that I think cannot be done this year or next year, but I hope is something we can work towards. So there is some success now in people that are blind, and labs like Peter Wolfsheimer's implant electrodes in V1. So they do monkeys, but other labs like Hull and Bosking do humans. And then they sort of paint on V1, so they form a letter like L or S or so, and there's a retopic mapping, so you can very easily do this. And then subjects that otherwise do not see can actually, with a limited set of number of letters, can recognize those letters. I think that's really cool. But also, they have a lot of trouble to scale this up to object level. Like basically, their approach is we're just going to do the edges, but we don't have enough electrode coverage or resolution to stimulate all those edges in like the rich visual world we live in. So if we were to be able to take those electrodes to higher visual areas and stimulate there, where like let's say in IT where we think objects are represented, then maybe that way we can actually elicit object level vision. But in IT, of course, we can't just paint on cortex. We don't know how to stimulate. But I think the models can tell us how. So if we had a good model of how neural activity is supposed to look like, then perhaps they can tell us what the right stimulation patterns would be for any visual input. I think that's one way this could go. There's probably also examples where you don't have to necessarily stick electrodes onto people. There's probably like stimulus to behavioral applications too. But yeah, this is one that I like. Yeah, I mean, ideally you would want like what Andreas calls a digital twin, right? Something that actually looks like the brain, and then you run the experiment on the digital twin, and then before running it in the real subject. Like I'm not saying the current models are good enough for this, but I think we can get there.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Martin, obviously for the great talk and really cool stuff. So, as someone who's worked on engineering these benchmarks, I'd like to hear about the quality control for the data coming in. Because I do have a little bit of a concern if like we can just, everyone knows I love Dandy here, I've said it like 10 times, but like if we just can dump everything on Dandy without any quality control, and then it automatically goes to benchmarks, you could see a potential problem with this, right? So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on this, having done it really successfully.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we've done that successfully. We haven't.
You put data on the web successfully.
I mean, so far we've taken data from people that we trust to have good data, I think. But there's one control which is, I think also what Alex is going to talk about more, to try and estimate the noise ceiling of the data. So if you have crappy data, presumably that number would be very low. And then that perhaps might be one criteria to exclude it. I'm not sure, maybe we just need some manual checks before actually inserting this, but I know right now when we put benchmarks on BrainScore, the packaging of data is by far the most painful process because there's so many different data sources. Everyone has their own favorite format. And if we can automate that, and like even if there's more manual work on top, I think that would already go a long way.